Podbean, your message amplified.
Ready to share your message with the world? Start your podcast journey with Podbean.
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 Podbean. Podbean, the AI-powered all-in-one podcast platform.
Thousands of businesses and enterprises trust Podbean to launch their podcasts.
Launch your podcast on Podbean today.
My school uses Podbean.
My church, too.
I love it. I really do.
You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium. Available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about Jacobo Grinberg, living and disappearing in the Matrix. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's intriguing tale.
Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum, who was born in Mexico City in 1946, was a Mexican neurophysiologist and psychologist who also studied Mexican shamanism, Eastern disciplines, meditation, astrology and telepathy through the scientific method, and had written more than 50 books about these subjects. He studied psychology at the Faculty of Psychology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, went to New York City to study psychophysiology at the Brain Research Institute, earned a PhD at the E. Roy John Laboratory, and with his doctoral research he focused on the electrophysiological effects of geometric stimuli on the human brain, or in other words, he was smarter than most other people. However, whatever his gifts, he gained most of his international attention just before his mysterious disappearance in the December of 1994, which still to this day remains an enigma that has captivated countless of amounts of people, including many conspiracy theorists, and debates among scholars and enthusiasts. Theories as to Jacobo Grinberg's disappearance include being kidnapped by the CIA, being abducted by aliens, and that he had slipped into another dimension or a holographic simulation of reality, or to us layfolk, he had simply vanished into the Matrix. But apart from a supposed sighting by a gas station worker in New Mexico, the elusive scientist has never been seen since. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this interdimensional episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, and a man with a very dark and disturbed sense of humour who only found out the other day that atheism is a non-profit organisation. Did you see what I did there? No? Okay. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, though occasionally on a Wednesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of the episode's subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. Or if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. And if you get a few minutes, perhaps you might like to check out my social media groups and pages, including Facebook, Instagram and TikTok, which are filled daily with all things unexplained and crime. I'll put the links to some of my socials in the description. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the conspiracy surrounding Jacobo Grinberg living and disappearing in the Matrix. And this week's necessary disclaimer: Well, this story is a tale that involves a missing person and drug use, so may prove upsetting to some, but as always, you listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case still remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, made me ask myself the other day, what if there were no hypothetical questions? But anyway, enough of this tomfoolery. Let us get back to the story. Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum, but for this podcast we'll just call him by his most popular name of Jacobo Grinberg, was born in Mexico City on the 12th of December in 1946, during a period of rapid modernisation in the country. His family members were Yiddish-speaking Jews from Poland who had arrived in Mexico in the early years of the 20th century. The family had escaped the violent riots that were aimed at massacring or expelling the ethnic and religious group in the so-called Pale of Settlement, which was the portion of the Russian Empire's western region where Jews were allowed a temporary residency. There doesn't appear to be much regarding Jacobo Grinberg's father, but his mother was a very significant figure in his life, and according to reports, his mother and father were in fact first cousins, which was a fact that worried the family when his parents were first announced their engagement. His mother was diagnosed with a brain tumour in 1956, so unfortunately passed away from a stroke just 2 years later, and Jacobo Grinberg, who was only 12 years old at the time, found this to be a very traumatic period of his life, and due to such an early dependence on his mother, and her being taken away from him, for the rest of his life he was never able to deal with women, for that once he met a girl, he would fall in love with them so quickly and way too easily, only for the relationship not to last. One of his aunts, an Aunt Hilda, remembers that after the death of his mother, Jacobo would become obsessed with otherworldly events, saying that in most of the photographs that were taken of him after that time, he is shown just gazing upward or in a distracted state, without also claiming that, and I quote,
his attention wandering and wandering.
In 1963, and still not quite in his 20s, Jacobo Grinberg went to live for a year on a kibbutz, which was an intentional community in Israel that was traditionally based on agriculture near Gaza. And whilst there, he fell in love with his first wife, Lisette Arditi, and he met a British medium who organised seances using the Ouija board to communicate with the dead. This exercise astounded Jacobo, so much so that rather than see the Ouija board as a form of entertainment, he started to seriously think about the possibility that the dead aren't altogether gone, but are instead in a sort of limbo, and that they might one day try to contact the living. His first wife, Lisette Arditi, recollects Jacobo stating, for example, that if a spirit had told him that at a certain hour of the day, let's say 6 p.m, his watch would stop, indeed, his watch would stop at that precise moment, and whether this was a coincidence or evidence of genuine contact with the dead, to Jacobo Grinberg, it didn't really matter, as far as he was concerned, a further area of discovery had just materialised right in front of him. It was also during his first of many trips to Israel that he discovered the depth of Kabbalistic thought, which is a profound and intricate system that seeks to explain the nature of God, the universe and the soul whilst visiting the city of Safed in Galilee. Jacobo Grinberg also discovered many other forms of meditative practices, as well as such concepts as Zinzum, which is the idea that God underwent self-contraction, thus producing emanations of light, Shavira Hakilim, which is the shattering of the divine vessel, or Sephirit, and Jejul, which is a transmigration of reincarnation of the soul. These concepts gave Grinberg heaps of inspiration, so much so that throughout his career he would then look for strategies to integrate them into his academic investigations. His Aunt Hilda said of their grandfather, who was an Orthodox Jew and died in Mexico, that Jacobo specifically requested all of his prayer and religious books, saying that, and I quote,
"He always had them next to him.
She continues, and again I quote,
They made him feel attached to his ancestry."
Upon returning to Mexico, Jacobo Grinberg enrolled at the University of Namibia, or UNAM for short, to study psychology, and then, as he fell under the influence of the 1960s counterculture, there was a shift in his personality, and so he left his first wife, Lizette Arditi, and moved to New York City, where his perspective on parascientific phenomena became more radical. He enrolled in a doctoral program in psychophysiology, a precursor of neurometrics, which is the science of understanding the electrical activity of the human brain, at the Brain Research Laboratory, and then focused his attention on the electrophysiological effects on the brain of such stimuli as geometric shapes and colours. However, Grinberg found this type of scientific research a little bit too restricting for him, as it didn't account for any alternative ways of knowing. So in 1977, he began teaching at UNAM, along with a portion of his time dedicated to making inquiries into things like memory, visual perception, and physiological psychology. After this first short break, in part 2 we will look at some of the brain tests that he carried out on his subjects, along with some of the results and the scepticism.
Ghost Planet Network, broadcasting from the other side. Ready to tune in to terror? The Ghost Planet Network is your new home for original paranormal content, streaming straight from beyond the veil. We have got it all: spine-tingling stories, chilling documentaries, and real paranormal investigations from the world's most haunted hotspots. Perfect for believers, skeptics, and anyone who loves a good scare. Join the paranormal TV revolution. Get unlimited access for just £12 per year. Tune in now. Email us at neil.hapra@gmail.com to sign up. That's neil.haprc@gmail.com.
At his laboratory, Jacobo Grinberg attempted to prove that children were able to communicate beyond the use of language, especially through sight, claiming that he could make children read the words on a page without them actually looking at the page. However, these supposedly psychic children, instead of them being able to read the words on the page, they unintentionally started to see what's known as cosas fees, which once translated from Spanish to English simply means ugly things, such as the spirits of the dead. So, as a result of this phenomena, parents started to pull their children out of the experiments, and Jacobo Grinberg became somewhat distressed, and his colleagues, including the world-renowned neuroscientist E. Roy John, began to doubt his techniques and question his findings, with E. Roy John claiming, and I quote, "The kinds of tests to which these data should be subjected are well known. He certainly knew what those tests were and never applied them. I don't think he had a dishonest bone in his body, but he certainly had a lot of wishful thinking." However, Jacobo Grinberg did have his defenders, such as the physicist Amit Goswami, who was then based at the University of Oregon. But more typically, it was the skepticism of Karl Pibram, who was one of the deans of America's neuroscience, who said, and I quote, "If it's true what he was finding, it could be very, very important. But I think that his work needs a lot of confirmation and testing in other laboratories." Jacobo Grinberg had been attracted to shamanism since his stay in Israel in the early 1960s. And like Kabbalists, one of these shamans' interests lie in a higher realm of consciousness and in connecting with earthly with the divine. So, with him being convinced that the mind was trapped in the human body, Jacobo sought to liberate the mind, either through meditation, hypnosis and or hallucinations. And not only did he participate in these practices, but he also led groups of initiated followers who were often in the proximity to an established curandero, or meaning a healer that uses folk remedies to oppose to standard medical care. According to reports, Jacobo Grinberg would later describe eating mushrooms and using other entheogenic substances, and he would also specify the number of participants, the visions they would experience, who speaks at what particular time, and what the shaman's overall behaviour was. Jacobo Grinberg, although attracted by rational thinking, was getting restless as his scientific research was now entering new horizons. He began to explore deeper into shamanism, which was widely embraced in Mexico, as well as other indigenous practices that had survived centuries of repression. He also studied the influential 13th century of Kabbalah, or the Zohar, to which Jacobo claimed at the time he felt drawn to like wood to fire, and as if he was often prone to mood swings, he would often consult the shaman healers. However, despite his students loving him and his continual success in being able to procure federal grants, his peers, who were perplexed by his refusal to allow scholars to corroborate his findings, and by his refusal to allow the students to work in his lab to speak to others, continued to find his investigations suspect.
Podbean, your message amplified.
Ready to share your message with the world? Start your podcast journey with Podbean.
Podbean, the AI-powered all-in-one podcast platform.
Thousands of businesses and enterprises trust Podbean to launch their podcasts.
Use Podbean to record your podcast.
Use Podbean AI to optimize your podcast.
Use Podbean AI to turn your blog into a podcast.
Use Podbean to distribute your podcast everywhere.
Launch your podcast on Podbean today.
Later in his life, Jacobo Grinber became one of the disciples of the, dare I use the word, celebrity, in Mexico's shamanic constellation, with a lady named Maria Sabina, who was an indigenous Mazatec woman who performed purification rituals using mushrooms. One humid night at Maria Sabina's home, Jacobo Grinberg ingested some of her mushrooms with the intention of chronicling his experiences. However, his hallucinations, which were brought on by the aforementioned mushrooms, blocked his rational thought. Maria Sabina was near him, repeatedly chanting the phrase, and I quote,
San Pablo, San Pablo.
At first he felt cold, agitated and uncomfortable, with his mind wandering along strange undulating streets, and then, finding this virtual reality mind-blowing scenario a little bit too much to handle, Jacobo left Sabina's house in a panic and ran out into the road, after which he was then imagining himself in the comfort of his living room reading quietly on his sofa. He then went back into the house and returned to Sabina's side, at which point the hallucinations stopped. And so, presumably, feeling a little refreshed after his Woodstock moment, he then thanked Maria Sabina for, and I quote, "having shown me one of the emotional refugees, my incapacity to live in the present and my tendency to escape reality to seek shelter in a structure of comfort." The outcome of these encounters, and more, was an experiment Jacobo Grinberg devised in 1987, with the experiment itself involving 2 participants who were each placed in this same room with electrodes attached to their heads. Jacobo then asked both participants to attempt telepathic communications, and then, after one of the participants was taken away elsewhere, the other was left stimulated by hearing and seeing both sounds and flashes. And so it was at that point that Grinberg, studying the brainwaves of each person, immediately recognised a simultaneous reaction to the distant participant, which he then named as transferred potential. And over the next few years, he would often repeat his experiment and eventually document transferred potential in a quarter of his subjects, and so therefore he eventually believed that the results of this experiment supported his theory of a neuronal field connecting all human minds. In later reports, they show that Jacobo Grinberg, who became a devotee to shamanic followers, reaches into Jewish history to make a particular point. For example, there is a section in Volume 1 of Los Kamini's book called The Hasidim of Morelos, in which Grinberg describes a shamanic group that performed its mystical rituals just like the 18th century followers of the Baal Shem Tov Israel ben Eliezer, who was the founder and leader of the mystical Hasidic movement, claiming that there was a special class of Hasidic Jew who are supposedly able to communicate with non-material entities, which help them cure an assortment of human ailments, including physiological and emotional. Yeah, I could probably come under one of those headings, I think. Anyway, I digress. Grinberg eventually, and over time, painted himself as a kind of Mexican Hasid, which is a member of a strictly Orthodox Jewish sect from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, who opposed Hellenizing influences on their faith and supported the Maccabean revolt. And on a short but interesting side note here, and mainly because I haven't done one for a while, the Maccabean revolt, which ran from 167 to 160 BCE, was a significant Jewish uprising against the Seleucid Empire led by the Maccabees, which resulted in the rededication of the Second Temple of the establishment of the independent Jewish state. There now. Aren't you glad I told you that? Anyway, I digress. Jacobo Grinberg, just like every other observant Jew, would also fast on Yom Kippur, otherwise known as the Day of Atonement. But rather than attend a synagogue to seek a state of introspection, he would travel about 50 kilometers to the highlands north of Mexico City and the ancient archaeological complex of Teotihuacan, which is in English simply means the birthplace of the gods. And each year he would climb the steep staircase of the Pyramid of the Sun and sit for hours on the promenade at the top, entering into a spiritual state. Just to take us up to the next break, and for those of us who do not know, Yom Kippur, which is otherwise known as the Day of Atonement, is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It is observed with a 25-hour fasting, during which Jewish people seek forgiveness for their sins and aim for reconciliation with God. This solemn day follows the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, which was on the 23rd of September in 2025, and concludes the 10 days of repentance, with Yom Kippur itself being a time for reflection, prayer and making amends, as it is believed to be the day when God decides each person's fate for that coming year. After this second short break in part 3, we will look at the further discoveries made by Jacobo Grinberg and what may have happened during his final days before he disappeared.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
In 1994, the year that Jacobo Grinberg went missing, Mexico underwent a major remuneration, and whilst all that was going on all around him, he became an enthusiastic supporter of the leftist political and militant group based in Chiapas, Mexico, called the Zapatistas. First by joining the marches through Mexico City, adding his signature to the public letters, and then by connecting the Zapatista movement to his explorations of shamanic experiences and to alternative studies of the mind. However, it was about this time that Jacobo Grinberg drifted further into the realms of impossibility, with indications that during this last period of his life he was being overwhelmed by an intense paranoia. For example, he would often make claims that he was being followed or that he was overwhelmed by a supernatural type of love, which led him to the conviction that he had become a deity. Over time, he started to seem unsettled, all of which brought the subject of his well-being into question, and in his later writings, he depicted himself as a space traveller who wandered through galaxies using telepathic connections, offering a survey of different advanced civilizations, traces of which were invisible to the naked eye. In his last set of interviews, Jacobo Grinber's grandiose explanations of the mechanics of the universe descended into a form of hyperbole by making things sound bigger and better than they probably were. But to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, I cannot help but think that the constant ingestion of mushrooms probably didn't help his case much, but we will see as we read on. During what turned out to be his final days, Jacobo Grinberg phoned his daughter, Estusha, to say that she was going to Kathmandu to participate in a series of meditations. However, if he did buy a ticket to Nepal, no airline has a record of him ever using it. In fact, one of Mexico's top sleuths and director of the Ministerio Público Especializado, Comandante Clement Padillo, could find no evidence to confirm that Jacobo Grinberg have ever departed from Mexico, period. And just to add to the mystery, no one saw him in Kathmandu either. According to reports, his siblings had organised a birthday party for him on the 12th of December in 1994, to which he didn't show up. But because it was common for him to make spontaneous travels or to just not answer his phone for a few days, his disappearance at first did not seem odd to his family. Although it did turn out that he had left various voicemails for one of his siblings saying that his second wife, Tia, had been persecuting him. But as it was common knowledge to his family that the two would often fight because of jealousy, they did not put too much stock in his messages. And again, according to reports, it appears that his second wife, Tia, not only suffered from bipolar disorder, but her own family did not even know that she was wedded to Jacobo Grinberg. And just to add a little bit more flame to the already bubbling pot, as it were, Jacobo Grinberg's close circle, which included his brothers, his daughter, his first wife, Lizette Arditi, and his Aunt Hilda, all felt that his second wife, Tia, was a imposter who represented a physical threat. But not only that, they also felt that she was part of a larger coterie with a vested interest in controlling him for whatever reason, with one of his brothers claiming that Jacobo feared he would be murdered, which he revealed to him during their final visit together. All the Grinberg family and friends have stated that Jacobo would never have left his job or his daughter, whom of which he adored of his own volition. In Spanish, the word aparecido, or aparecido, one of those, is used to refer to a ghost, spirit, or an apparition. And ever since Jacobo Grinberg's disappearance, or, as some might prefer to say, dissolve into the ether, it appears that he has been precisely that, a spirit which people keep summoning for various kinds of reasons. And for this, and for these people at least, he is proof that death isn't final, and that somehow a person who vanishes hasn't just simply disappeared completely, but has simply been misplaced, with some of his followers believing that one day he will come back. And when he does, he will be a little bit wiser and a little bit cleverer regarding all the mysteries of the universe, who is still talked about by his family, at least, with great affection. Jacobo Grinberg has been missing since the 8th of December of 1994, and as you could probably imagine, the disappearance of someone like Grinberg would predictably spark all manner of theories as to what could have happened to him. These theories include the more commonplace ideas such as that he has been kidnapped by the CIA, or that he has been abducted by aliens, along with the more outlandish ones like that the scientists had gone so far with explorations of shamanism and consciousness that he had simply slipped into another dimension. One theory regarding his disappearance is connected to Grinberg's belief of the holographic simulation of reality, and if you have read any of the books by David Icke or have watched the Keanu Reeves 1999 sci-fi blockbuster of The Matrix, then you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. With Jacobo's idea being that if we turn our minds to it, we can then interact with perceptual reality, meaning that we're not just watching it, but we're being involved with it in a more active sense. But apart from a possible sighting by a gas station worker in New Mexico, Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum has never been seen since. And according to a group of spiritualists, after having performed a series of seances and various other rituals in an attempt to find the whereabouts of the good Dr. Grinberg, they say that he is in Bardo, which is the Buddhist liminal state between death and rebirth.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 170, we are going to be looking at what were the skyrockets. Ghost rockets were rocket or missile-shaped unidentified flying objects sighted in 1946, mostly in Sweden and nearby countries. Investigations concluded that many ghost rocket sightings were probably caused by meteors. However, debate continues as to the origins of the unidentified ghost rockets.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations, of course, were all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters, and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast if they're happy for me to do so. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. No AI was used or harmed in the making of this or any other episode of Mark's Unexplained World. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.